Williams, Executive Director of the United States Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled The Impacts of COVID-19 on the Power Sector. We are grateful to our moderator, Dr. Melissa Lott from Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, and our distinguished panelists for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the United States Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest affiliate of the International Association for Energy Economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find on our website at www.usae.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We kindly request that you do not send your questions by email. We have allocated enough time at the end of the webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Melissa Lott, Senior Research Scholar and lead of the Power Sector Research Initiative at the Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University. Melissa, over to you.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks to you and Rebecca and USAE for organizing this event, which we at the Center are very pleased to co-host. Hi, everyone who's joining us and coming in at the start of the hour. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the impacts of COVID-19 on the U.S. power sector. As Dave said, my name is Melissa Lott, and I'm a Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University in New York City. In that work, I lead the Center's Power Sector Research Initiative, and we focus in our research on the nexus of energy, climate change, and public health. In this, we explore the technical, economic, and policy aspects of the energy transition, so the topic that we have for today's webinar is close to my heart, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with our panelists, who I'm going to introduce here in a moment after just a few really brief introductory remarks. As we are all aware, actions to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 have had significant effects on energy demand in the United States and around the world. Not only in oil and natural gas markets, but in the power sector, which we'll discuss today. We're really feeling the impacts of the pandemic, both indirectly and directly. So indirectly, reduced economic activity is leading to overall decreases in electricity demand and a shift in where we see the peaks and how high they are across large swaths of the country. At the same time, we're seeing shifts in how and where we are using electricity. And as our panelists are going to discuss in greater detail and go through, the impacts of COVID-19 on electricity use, both total demand and demand patterns, has been significantly different amongst the subsectors, that is residential, commercial, industrial customers, et cetera. As one example, according to analysis that was published yesterday by some of my colleagues over in the engineering department at Columbia, in New York City, we have a swath of apartments that we track in terms of electricity use to better understand how we use electricity. And they're seeing that electricity use in those apartments has increased by 7% during weekdays and 4% on weekdays compared to pre-COVID-19 expectations. What's more, if you look at midday electricity demand during the week, we're looking at an overall increase in kilowatt hours of about 23% during the week, and during the weekend, about 10%. And this is going on at the same time that unemployment is skyrocketing. So questions about the ability not only for businesses, but also residential customers to continue to pay their monthly electricity bills is looming before policymakers and utilities. Anecdotally, I'm also hearing from utilities that I work with that we're seeing some geographic shifts in demand, which could stem somewhat from people leaving cities as one example to ride out this pandemic in other locations with their family or otherwise. More directly, utilities and grid operators across the US are facing the same challenges that all of us are facing across the country. That is increasing illnesses and risk of illness across the workforce, which could challenge their ability to keep power flowing. Not to mention the cascading impacts resulting from extended closures of schools and childcare facilities is just one example. But to date, I'll say in my own observations and in all the publications that have been put out so far, I'll say that utilities and grid operators have really faced this challenge head on with a focus on being proactive instead of reactive in order to keep this essential service running and keep the lights on for all of us. For example, on March 23rd, the grid operator from the state of New York began housing some essential workers on site in order to reduce their potential exposure to COVID-19. And plans are being put in place to manage the approximately 30 nuclear power plants that are scheduled for refueling this spring, a process that would typically bring together large numbers of workers very closely, leading to increased risk of exposure and resulting energy security concerns. Combined, all of these indirect and direct impacts have raised a number of questions, including the ones that we'll discuss on this panel, which you all saw in the invitation and overview of the discussion, which apparently brought you here, so you'll find them interesting, I hope. In terms of our overall structure, for today's panel, I've asked each of our speakers to present for about 10 minutes. After that, we'll branch into a more broad discussion. And in this discussion, I'm going to be watching for your questions in the Q&A window to help facilitate an active discussion that isn't just full of my favorite questions, but is full of all of yours. So the pressing questions that you have on your mind right now about the impacts of this ongoing pandemic on the US power sector. So with that, I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists, and I would refer you back to the overall email blast and website that included their full bios. But I'll quickly introduce first Joshua Rhodes. So Dr. Rhodes is a researcher in the Weber Energy Group at the University of Texas at Austin, who also serves as a data advisory board member of the Pecan Street Project. And Joshua is going to give us an overview of what we are seeing in terms of not only changes in electricity demand and demand profiles, but how these changes are manifesting in the different subsectors, including changes in residential demand, HVAC use, electric vehicle charging, et cetera. After that, we'll move to Dr. Elta Colo, who's the content lead for the Grid Edge team at Wood Mackenzie, which looks at the meeting point of the last mile of distribution and the customer. Elta works on utility digitalization and flexibility in the US electricity markets. And at Wood Mackenzie, the Grid Edge team monitors the impact of this pandemic on utility operators, the ecosystem that are employed by utilities, and the distributed energy ecosystem. And this can include everything from distributed solar, electric vehicles, energy storage, et cetera. And she's going to step us through a lot of really interesting things that we're seeing in terms of DER deployments and other Grid Edge investments. And last on our panel today will be Mr. Ed Fortunato. He is the chief economist for Exelon. And as the chief economist at Exelon, he tracks economic trends and how they impact not only power markets, but also natural gas and oil markets. And today he's going to talk us through what we're seeing on the ground and how utilities are responding. And he's going to make sure that we all stay grounded in what is actually going on. He's also going to provide comments on how shifts across the different energy markets are impacting the system. So taking us out of the power sector for a moment and reminding us about how the different sectors intersect. I want to thank again each of our panelists for joining us today. Thank you so much for saying yes to the invitation. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So with that, I will pass the baton over to Joshua. So Dr. Joshua Rhodes from UT Austin. So please take it away.
All right, thank you. All right, share the screen. Okay, are my slides up? Good to go? Okay, so thank you for having me today, Melissa. Yes, my name is Joshua Rhodes, research associate at the Weber Energy Group at the University of Texas at Austin. We look at systems level, high level impacts of different things on the energy system, how it's evolving, how it has evolved. And today we're going to talk about how COVID-19 is affecting U.S. electricity use. And so we're seeing, COVID-19 is reducing how much electricity we actually do consume, how much actually we use. And right now, or what we're seeing now, is about an 8 to 9% reduction in the total amount of energy being used in the lower 48 US states, with wholesale market prices being down around 36%, which kind of makes sense given that it doesn't take much reduction in price or it doesn't take much reduction in use for wholesale prices to decline. For the power plants that are out there supplying this energy, we're burning less coal, burning more natural gas, and more renewables are on the system. Now we are burning less coal because we've retired more coal than we've retired coal since last year, but we are actually burning less than retirements would indicate. Now, this reduction in electricity consumption is not equally shared among different sectors. So some parts of the economy that are very intensive, where people are meeting together, like car dealerships, restaurants, religious organizations, their energy use is down quite a bit, in some case over half of between the 1st and the 4th week of March, when a lot of the stay-at-home orders came into effect. And you see schools down, industrial in general is down around 20%. I was a little more bullish about these numbers until some of these figures came out earlier today, and they look a little worse than I thought that they did. Hospital energy use is up, which will make sense. We're sending a lot of people to hospitals right now to treat this pandemic. But liquor stores and pizza are also kind of through the roof. So if you had invested in those, you're probably doing all right. Also, storage units are up as college students are no longer in college cities, and people are probably putting off moves at this point in time. So COVID-19 is also changing when, not only how or how much, but also when we use our electricity. Sorry for the typo in the title. So on the left-hand side is New York City. So Melissa talked a little bit about different changes in New York City. So that's a significant reduction in the amount of load that we're seeing in New York City. And a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that people are not traveling into the city to work, or if they are, if they do live in the city and they have a second home and are able to leave, they have left and are, weathering the quarantine out somewhere. If everyone's working from home, probably didn't want to be in New York when it was kind of one of the centers of the outbreak. On the right-hand side is ERCOT. So this is the grid operator for about 90% of Texas. And just note that the y-axis is about 10 times higher on that side because it's for basically the entire state of Texas. And so what these two lines are, the darker line is showing what ERCOT's models are. So what they model electricity to be given the temperatures outside, time of year, things like that. And these models are actually usually really good. But we're starting to see that, the modeled peak demand and actual realized peak demand, or the part at the very top. And so, it's an indication that big industrials, like I showed or commercial industrial usage, like I showed in the past slide, are not using as much energy as they were before. And also, it's interesting to watch, and this has been seen in other places, that we're starting to use energy later in the day, and people are basically sleeping in more. Get your kids ready for work, get ready for school, and get ready to go to work so much you're probably just sliding into your best pair of pajamas and then getting into do Zoom meetings all day. Now, one of the things that we'll see is I think we'll actually this is not going the right way. We'll actually see more of this as because right now we're in a shoulder season for energy, so we're not in heating season, not in cooling season just yet. But as we move into more where we get into more of these seasons, or we're using more for thermal, we'll see this to be more of an issue. However, so while commercial and industrial down, the residential sector use is up, as Melissa alluded to. And so on the left-hand side, I'm showing data from Pecan Street, which is a nonprofit in Austin that monitors a couple hundred homes. And they monitor not only total energy use, but sub-circuit, so HVAC, EV charging, refrigerator, all these kinds of things. And one of the things we're seeing more energy use during the day, as Melissa said. So that gray line is average from 2017 to 2019 March energy use. And the orange line is a few days in March after Austin, Texas put in their stay-at-home order. And so instead of dipping during the day as people leave and go to work and go to school, we're actually seeing energy use increase up into a higher peak, and actually an earlier peak in the day, which is interesting because it actually confirms a chapter of my dissertation where I looked at the effects of staying at home and energy use patterns and all that kind of stuff. So nice to see that, but not for the reasons that we're seeing it for. On the right-hand side, we're seeing, it's looking at HVAC use. So this is basically air conditioning use per cooling degree day. And a cooling degree day is kind of is a measure of, how much energy you would use to keep your house a comfortable temperature given what the temperature is outside. And because that is increasing, it just means that we're using more energy to keep our houses cool, as an indication of we're in our houses more, and so we're using that energy more often. But you've probably seen charts for gasoline consumption reducing, but EV charging has also declined. And so these are some of the same data from Pecan Street. So we're looking at March 2020 versus previous March for homes that have EV chargers that Pecan Street's monitoring. It's relatively constant for past years, but it has definitely declined as people are just driving less as they are with gasoline. And residential duct curve is fading. And so the gray line is, again, the March 2017 through 2019 average, where these are data for homes that have solar. So this is whole home use for homes that have solar. And so we're seeing energy use increase as people wake up, and then as they leave and go to work, and the solar kicks on because the sun's moving across the sky, energy consumption actually goes negative. So they're pushing energy to the grid. But after Austin issued their stay-at-home orders and people are staying at home, they're actually consuming that energy instead of pushing it to the grid. So on average, Austin homes that have solar are no longer pushing energy to the grid. They're self-consuming that energy within them, which is probably a good thing, because commercial and industrial actually are not consuming that much more energy either. And so there's many interconnected markets that are kind of in flux right now. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. So I'll touch on oil, which I know will be talked a little bit more. But if we have less oil production, it may lead to less natural gas production, because a lot of our natural gas is associated with oil. About 12% of U.S. natural gas production is associated with oil production. But with the crash in oil prices, if we stop producing oil, we might have less natural gas, which might raise the price of natural gas. And because natural gas is a marginal generator in a lot of different grids, could raise the price of electricity. However, that still depends on load, because it's supply and demand. And so if load is down, that could keep electricity prices lower, particularly in grids that rely on things like scarcity pricing, where just a small reduction in demand can reduce prices quite a bit. Renewables are being seen as kind of a safe haven in this world, because particularly when renewable projects are signed and built, they're usually for 10, 15 years, and investors are seeing, are no longer thumbing their noses at 6% rates of return when the world out there is so turbulent. And actually seeing that from John Ketchum, the CEO of NextEra, is talking about, what higher natural gas prices could mean for their projects. It doesn't seem like going down. And back. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I really appreciate that. I'll now pass it over to Dr. Colo. So Elsa, do you mind taking us next?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I will share my screen now, as I have to figure it out. Let's see.
Right. I think it's in the middle of the bottom, should be green.
Yep. For some reason, my PowerPoint is not showing up. So let's see, I'll share my full screen and then we can go from there. Here we go. I think, can you see it?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, first of all, for having me on this webinar. So I just love the fact that I get to interact with academics. So today I'll be talking a little bit about the implications for grid edge, right? So my role on the grid edge team at Wood Mackenzie Prime Renewables is essentially leading the content that we develop for our practice, right? So what does this kind of mean in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, right? So I have to say that we have a global team that is covering the coronavirus implications across, the energy transition space, right? And the grid edge is just one small portion of it. So it is an integrated analysis that we do. We look at macroeconomic factors and looking at both qualifying and quantifying the pandemic's impact. So from a grid edge perspective, we essentially focus on utilities, specifically distribution utilities. And, first and foremost, we're looking at utility operations. As Melissa mentioned, utilities have put critical staff in quarantine to, make sure that we can sit here and have our Zoom call today, right? So that's absolutely fantastic. And of course, with that comes a plethora of partners that utilities work with to be able to do this. So with that comes, looking at the impact on the ecosystem the utilities employ, right? We can look at it from a, distributed energy resources deployment at large, but, we can also look at it, again, from the ecosystem that they're working with at this stage. And of course, looking at our industry and, where we're at from a distributed ecosystem perspective, we are also monitoring to see the impacts that it is having there as well. So with that, a little bit about the grid edge, right? As Melissa mentioned, we are looking at the meeting point of the last mile of distribution and the customer. So essentially looking at distribution down and behind the meter. So when we look at DER deployment, we have to look at kind of three overarching factors as we're assessing, the implications, right? So we have to look at macroeconomics, essentially looking at the overarching availability of funds for DER deployment. Again, we have to look at the project development and what building a feasible pipeline and executing on it looks like. So we kind of have this overarching view at the bottom here, where you can see what is it that you can do remotely at this time when everyone is sheltering in place, and versus what we have to wait for deployment purposes, right? So if we look at customer acquisition, sales, and financing, these are all activities that can be moved remote at this stage. And then obviously for siting and permitting, installation and commissioning, this is something that you do need to deploy staff on site. So it'll be interesting to see when you kind of can return to that operation. And this is essentially at this stage, kind of shifting timelines for deployment. And then when we look at operating the assets, this is something that you can do remotely with intelligent software control. So as we talk about utilities, right, we also have to think about, the broader long-term and short-term implications, right? When we look at utility sales cycles for technologies across the board, we are looking at sales cycles of 1 to 3 years. So yes, we're going to see these sales cycles exacerbated, but at the same time, we also have to keep in mind that public utilities commissions, staff from utilities, they're all working remotely at this stage, right? So even when we're looking at approving rate cases, for instance, public utilities commissions are, working really hard remotely. I think in the first half of this year so far, what we've seen is a lot of electrification dockets get approved, right? Spending for building electrification, for mobility electrification, that reaches over $1 billion across the US. So we are seeing activity and funds allocated. Where we're going to see delays is obviously in the implementation phase. And at this stage, what I have to highlight is that utilities have access to a plethora of data, right? Right now, we see 103 million advanced meter deployed across the US. So utilities have kind of unique data that they can work with, both to better understand and service their customers right now, because, especially in the residential side, we are so hypersensitive to our electricity usage at this stage. So in some ways, utilities actually have this unparalleled opportunity to essentially engage their customers. And from my point of view, what I'll talk about a little bit later, it is something that could create some opportunity looking ahead. So when we look at distributed energy resources, what is the impact that we expect to see through the end of 2020 in terms of deployments, right? Our fantastic solar team is expecting to see over a 1 gigawatt decline in residential demand for solar at this stage. So that's a huge decline. We're essentially, when we look at our base case, that's a 16 to 34% decline in deployment year over year. But we are expecting to see 21 recover to almost near the same levels of deployment that we expected when we did our late 2019 forecast. Energy storage, globally, the market, we're expecting it to contract by about 20%, but year over year, we're still actually expecting to see growth. So it'll be interesting to see, especially when we look at some of the supply chain disruptions, how much of that we can get online by the end of the year. And a lot of that depends on, regional, relaxation of restrictions of sheltering in place. And global EVs will take a hit this year. We're going to see a 43% decline year over year to 1.3 million. But I think we also have to think about kind of, the 5-year plan, plus especially from the automotive sector to actually, commit to new models for EVs. And like I said, example of, commitments continuing, and this is over $1 billion in the UK earlier this year, for instance, was allocated for building out fast charging infrastructure and continuing to support electrification. In the US as well, we have states that are still using Volkswagen settlement funds, to continue on building their mobility electrification efforts. So we are seeing funds continue to be allocated. It's just, I think, through the end of the year, we're not going to see as much momentum. But I think the important thing is that we're seeing money still allocated towards that. And of course, I specifically focus on demand response for a big chunk of my research. So, can't forget about smart thermostats in this case as, a form of distributed energy resource flexibility in the home and buildings. So, as of today, I think what we've estimated is that there's about 30 million smart thermostats in residential homes, and we are actually expecting to see a massive decline, I would say, through the end of 2020 that will lead into 2021 in terms of adoption, and that's because it has a lot to do with customer spending, right? Macroeconomic factors are contributing to that. And of course, right, there's things that we know going into summer 2020, and there's, a lot of uncertainty. So I put these into kind of 3 buckets, and I'll kind of guide you through a little bit of my research on this. So overall, as Joshua very well outlined, we are seeing continuing demand declines across ISO and RTO territories in the US, right? Commercial and industrial demand will decline into summer 2020. And I think, it depends on how restrictions ease and when people are able to go back to work. And that's creating a lot of uncertainty. And residential demand will increase. It is increasing even when shelter-in-place orders are lifted. Those that can work from home through the summer will likely do that. And all of this uncertainty on the demand side is actually creating a lot of load forecasting uncertainty when we talk about utility operations and when we talk about ISO and RTO operations. And we're already seeing that, right? It's not like you can use, demand and supply curves from previous years to estimate what will happen in the summer 2020. It will be a unique summer, that is for sure. So I think it'll be interesting to see how forecasting is approached from grid operators. Will residential load have a significant impact on grid operations, especially as we talk about HVAC consumption going up? And of course, I look at demand response in power systems, right? And the summer is a time when demand response is looked at as a flexibility resource. And if we are going to see these rising demand levels on the residential side, is this a flexibility resource that we can access, right? And the reason I say that is because when we look across ISO and RTO territories, we have to think about, the 33 gigawatts of demand response that is available today, right? And a majority of that actually comes from manufacturing optimization efforts. It comes from HVAC control, majority from commercial and industrial sites, some residential, and around 1/3 of it is, 25% is backup generators being turned on for demand response events, right? So, we have a bunch of other resources that are participating, but not in these meaningful levels. So when we look at this resource mix that, ISOs and RTOs have contracted, is this something that we will have access to and be able to tap into in the summer of 2020? So this is something that, I'm exploring right now. And it'll be interesting to see if we are able to kind of shift some of this flexibility into, the next shoulder months, right? So we talked about being in shoulder months right now. And what about September, October, when hopefully, we'll get back to some sort of normal, but the grid will still be stressed, right? Because we'll have all these people going back to work, getting back into cities. So grid operators will probably still need flexibility. And as we've seen in the last few years, this is just an example from the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator having called demand response events on non-summer months, right? We saw an example in PJM last year where they called the first demand response event, emergency event since 2014 in October. And that was a non-summer month, not a time when you expect to be using demand response. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves. If we talk about New York right now, Demand Response Trade Alliance actually just filed a petition asking to ease some of the demand response requirements for city going into the summer months, essentially, and also asking for the ability to essentially move some of that flexibility into the shoulder months as well. And that is because, one, to kind of make sure that, the business is still alive, going as we exit this pandemic, but also making sure that this flexibility is available to the operators as we get into, more uncertainty of how load will evolve over the coming months. And then, what can we actually access, right, in terms of flexibility? And I keep going back to this. And I said that this is an unparalleled time for utilities to engage with their customers, right, because we are going into the summer months. We are going to see increased demand on the HVAC side, on the residential sector. And when we look at regulated utility territories that we've surveyed, we have about 35 gigawatts of flexibility that utilities have access to. And across the US, if we do kind of the intersection of ISOs and RTOs plus utility territories, we have about 50 gigawatts. About a third of that 35 gigawatts is residential demand response. Will we be able to tap into that? One, because customers are increasingly aware of their electricity usage. So our utilities kind of using this time to sign up customers to make sure that they have access to that flexibility, essentially because they expect a lot of variability in load. And two, will customers be a lot more essentially aware of their electricity usage, and that $50 to $100 that you may save from being signed onto a program and responding, essentially be more meaningful considering the current economic situation. So these are kind of some of the questions that I'm running into. And I just kind of wanted to point you a little bit into the sectors that are providing demand response, globally. So PJM is a really great example here because, you can see that around 50% of the demand response there comes from manufacturing. Is that something that they'll be able to access this summer, right? And going into the shoulder months. 16% residential. Will they be able to tap into that? Every event that they've had, whether it has been on the economic side or the emergency demand response side, has had participation from the residential sector in the last few years. Schools is that flexibility that you can access if you don't actually have people in the schools, right? Office buildings, will they be occupied enough to provide flexibility? And of course, hospitals, being in kind of a critical situation that they are in now, is electricity flexibility high on their agenda. And that's kind of some of the questions that I ran into. I think when I was planning this with Melissa, I said I probably have more questions than answers, but this is something looking at going into the summer in terms of power sector impacts and flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Alta. And you are certainly not alone with the questions. And thanks to y'all who've already sent in some of your questions. I'd like to flag that, Joshua, you actually answered one unknowingly as you went through with regards to the duct curve. So success. That's fantastic. So I'll pass it on to our last panelist before we open it up to Q&A. Again, a reminder, please send in your questions. But for now, I'll hand it over to Mr. Ed Fortunato. So Ed, if you'll take it away.
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's safe and healthy during this time. Just wanted to comment on a few things that some of my colleagues on the panel had said, and thank them for their great work. The first thing is just the fact that coal demand is down. We had been seeing coal demand be down just because of the bad weather and cheap gas prices we've seen over the last few months, way before COVID started. And as a result, we're seeing just a lack of production at the source of the mine. Peak demand or peak production for coal over the last number of years historically is about 1.2 billion tons. That number is under 500 million now. As a result, you're just seeing cheap gas kind of come dominate that and winter weather. The other thing I wanted to mention is I was on a call yesterday and we had a wide range of discussion of oil and gas and power. And one of my colleagues on the call said, well, power and gas are COVID proof. The market hasn't collapsed, like oil has. And I thought about it for a second. I'm like, is it COVID proof? And of course, we haven't seen negative $37 unless you're looking at a spring price for a Midwestern power, and that happens occasionally. But oil is such a stable commodity. You have winter demand for heating oil kind of peak, and you have gasoline demand this summer peak, and it's kind of a yin and yang situation. And and demand has been pretty steady between 19 and 20 million barrels for the last 10 or 12 years. It had been gently growing before that. Global demand's increased pretty steadily, 1 million to 1.5 million barrels every year for the last decade or so. So demand's been so stable. And, a shock to the system like this, that we've seen a 6.5 million barrel decline in gasoline demand over the last, few months, 35 million barrel demand decrease globally, probably for the month of April, going to 25 as the situation improves. power and gas do that all the time. And the perfect example I use of that is, natural gas itself. On a peak day in the dead of winter with a cold New England, you'll have 145 BCF a day peak. And on a quiet day in the springtime with things are tranquil and everybody's, basking in 65 or 70 degree weather, you'll have a 55 BCF demand day. So, demand can almost triple from one day to the next or one time to the next. So there's built-in flexibility in the system. The same goes for power. The lack of storage capacity in power brings natural redundancies to the system and natural ability to swing from low to high demand. And it's got even more robust over the last few years with renewables. Renewables are great, but in my company, we call them intermittent resources because they're just not steady like gases or other fossil fuels are. And as a result, you need to have quick response to changes in the velocity of the wind, in wind direction, in solar panels with clouds in the area. And those things are way more volatile than temperature. So, you look at the situation that we have right here. Markets have come down. Power prices are cheaper now than they were just a couple of weeks ago. But natural gas, on the other hand, is ironically even stronger than it has been. You look at short-term prices. You got down to $1.55 in prompt month. You're trading around $1.80 now, and it's just still kind of, suffering from the oversupply in the market we saw over the last winter. But what you've seen in the winter months is, the January contracts trading above $3, or it was early this morning. That had been trading as low as $2.50 just a couple of weeks ago. And that's a result of associated gas. And I know Joshua mentioned it in his comments, but that's a huge part of what we do. And oil production in this country has steadily grown in the last 10 years from about 5 million barrels a day to about just under 13 million barrels a day, which is a huge shift. And the infrastructure for that is just catching up. And what you're looking at right now is a situation where, you're going to have to shut in production because there's just not enough storage capacity for oil right now. And as a result, that when you stop producing oil out of shale rock, and I'm not a geologist, I don't play one on TV, but when you have shale, you're pulling oil out of a rock, which seems almost physically impossible. But really, one of the things you need for that is a propellant, and it's natural gas, the propellant. Almost like you take a bottle of champagne and use the carbon dioxide as propellant to get the liquid out. That's really what you're doing. The same concept is oil. And when you take that oil away and shut it in, you're going to move away from gas production that comes with it, associated gas. Our estimates are about 3 BCF a day. On the low side, I've heard estimates as high as 15 BCF a day. My thoughts are it's probably going to be about 5 to 8 BCF a day. And that's going to clean up a lot of mess in gas and oversupply. And what you're going to see is a hugely oversupplied market right now, probably getting to balance by the time winter comes. And you're probably looking at, pretty productive prices in the winter, probably over 3.25, or 350, maybe, 325 going forward in the next summer. And that'll send a signal to just drill for dry gas, which we haven't had in a long time. So the dynamics of the gas market could shift. And since gas is the marginal molecule that produces power, we'll probably see an increase in power prices going forward. So for as bearish a situation as it is, and I work at a utility company that we have 5 different regions that we serve. The number of 7 to 9%, or was mentioned before, and I agree with that number. Our company's seeing the same thing nationally, but we're seeing variations based on regions, geography, industrial and consumer splits, and also the severity of the virus. New York City itself is down probably 15% in demand. The Chicagoland area is probably closer to 5 or 6%. So that you get an average of 9%, but it really varies quite wide. And just like Joshua pointed out, with pizzerias and liquor stores doing well, and auto dealerships doing poorly, you're seeing the same variation in industrial load in different areas, to consumers, to residentials, where residential's increasing about 2 to 3% nationally. And I love Joshua's talking about putting your pajamas on and going to work, but the load ramp we see in the mornings is very similar to a snow day. You have much later ramps and much flatter demand going forward at the end of the day. So it's like in a perverse way, it's like a 70-day snow day that we've had here with sequestration. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Lott, and we can open up for questions.
Thanks, Ed. Really appreciate it. And thanks again, Joshua, Elta, and Ed, for your initial comments to get us started. And to all the people who are already sending in questions, I'm going to start with a clarifying one to Elta, to Dr. Polo. On slide 4, can you just clarify very quickly if those numbers for smart thermostats are those US numbers, or what percentage were US numbers within that?
Oh,
I think
that's a great question. Those are, so it's 103 million smart thermostat. The thermostat. Sorry, I thought you said the smart meters. The 30 million. That's in the U.S.
Okay,
not
great. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. But we are expecting, a 50 to 75 percent decline in annual sales going in through the end of this year and into 2020.
Now,
Dr. Polo, can I ask a question on that myself and interrupt? I apologize, but
no,
if I'm sitting at home and my demand for electricity is a lot higher, do you think I'd invest in that to save money? A smart thermostat?
Yeah.
And kind of hopefully balance out that plunge in demand.
Yeah, so this is why I'm saying that this is like an almost like unparalleled opportunity for utilities to engage with customers for residential demand response programs, because you're not going to have access to commercial and industrial flexibility over the summer that you might need, right? So you might have to rely on resi load. I know that in Texas, it like doubles the peak, I think, the HVAC resi load in the summer, right? So if you are looking to ramp up residential demand response programs, this is a fantastic time to do it, especially if you're looking at bring your own thermostat type of demand response programs. And you also have to keep in mind that utilities, to actually like ramp up and get a residential demand response program in place, marketing costs can be up to 50% of that. So if you have like a budget already allocated and rebates ready to go out to customers, this is the time when customers are reading their text messages, reading their emails from utilities. So it's a fantastic time to get these programs off the ground and also actually get a lot of like grid reliability out of it. And get some innovation in these programs too, make them a lot more automated and a lot more responsive. Josh, I think you have some comments.
Yeah, no, residential demand is half of ERCOT peak demand, and the majority of that's driven by air conditioning. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, and some utilities have gone into that. Like Austin Energy has a big rollout of smart thermostats, and some other in the deregulated areas as well. But yeah, it's a good program.
So Joshua, if I could do a follow-up with you real quick, because we had our first question that came in from a Stuart Cohen. He wondered if you've been thinking about the percent change in like use, so demand for electricity, and change in wholesale prices. Do you think these effects would be different if you extended if you extended or restarted our economy, I guess, at different times of year, given that March is usually lower demand, et cetera? He would expect the price reductions to be more significant in March or April than in a higher demand period, where those marginal costs would be more stable. Do you have any comments on that?
Right. So my head is often in ERCOT, and a lot of times I'm also thinking about scarcity pricing and like the effect of the operating reserve demand curve, and just a little bit of reduction in demand can move you further down that curve, so you're not seeing the impacts of it so much. But also when grids are stressed and like us and demand is high, those last few power plants that are on the stack are usually the ones, the peakers are the ones that are have some of the highest marginal costs. And so if you're looking at a reduction off of that, because we're not probably going to see that many more power plants retire before the summer than those that were already going to retire potentially kind of before the summer, since this thing has hit so fast. But I don't know. I think the reduction in prices might be higher during peak times than they are in kind of the shoulder seasons. But again, that will vary from location to location. And I'm probably thinking too much of ERCOT and not being meddled with capacity payments and all that kind of thing as well.
Makes sense. And then Ed, I'm going to actually bunch a couple of questions together. This is around natural gas and the effects of this. Where are natural gas prices going? If you're going to be, what is that going to do to gas-fired generation? What is the oil price crash going to, do? What does this balance look like? And there's a specific comment from Mike talking about U.S. LNG exports, which I don't think we touched on, and how that might affect the overall dynamics and prices. And I know you've got a lot of deep background in natural gas, so would you mind expanding on that a bit?
Sure, I'd like to. And if I don't hit on all the questions, Melissa, please remind me what I missed. But
Cool.
since you started with LNG,
Mhm.
you know, our view is fairly stable as far as LNG exports go. We've seen stability. We've seen about 9 BCF a day of exports, give or take. We haven't seen any big maintenance projects coming down the line. We haven't seen any, you know, just pure kind of we're shutting this thing down because it makes no sense to run. So we've seen kind of fairly steady LNG. One of the things we did see is a cancellation of a few, about 20 cargoes out of some Gulf Coast LNG facilities for April or May. And, you know, that may have an impact, but most of the contract language for the LNG facilities that have been built so far is take or pay. So even if you're not going to take that cargo, you're going to pay for it. So, you know, we expect some fairly stable, you know, LNG production coming out of there. The next thing about LNG is there are a lot of final investment decisions expected for LNG second wave type of facilities coming down the road in 2020, and they're all going to be canceled at least till 2021. So we'll even see if they come along. So you know the market pickup in supply in the 24 to 2025 time period will probably get delayed a little bit, and the market for LNG will probably get tighter at you know longer and on longer dated basis. As far as oil production, the oil crash was historic this week, and I think everyone's overused the word historic very accurately and very, very overused over the last couple of months. But, you know, it sent a message. And the message it sent was brutal and vicious, you know, with a negative price and a collapse in the forward months of the curve. But what it said is OPEC, Russia, and the Texas Railroad Commission couldn't make enough cuts to avoid storage capacity. And the market had to do it themselves. And, you know, what it came down to is, you know, you had a $10 contract settling on the May contract. You saw negative $37 prices at 37 and change in the day before. And that market message is stop producing oil. And what you're going to see is wells that are called stripper wells. And they're all wells that are about 100 barrels or less a day. They're generally pretty old. And they're just stripping out the last barrels of product out of the reservoir. They'll probably shut in pretty quickly. It's a couple million barrels a day. It'll have a couple BCF a day impact on associated gas with them. Those are the ones we'll see. But the West Texas Permian Basin is going to have to shut down some production. There's associated gas with that. North Dakota is going to have to do the same. We'll see parts of Oklahoma doing that. And you'll probably see the 3 to 5 BCF decline. And right now we had, I'll just read these numbers to you because I didn't memorize them. We have 2.14 trillion cubic feet of gas in the ground as of today. We had the storage number come out. And the capacity is about 4 trillion cubic feet, give or take 100 BCF. And we're about 800 BCF ahead of last year, which is just a tremendous surplus. And this lack of associated gas coming out of the ground is going to mop up that surplus over the next 5 or 6 months as we go into winter. And that's why you see in the price of January gas or winter gas being a lot more expensive than it was last year. and a lot more expensive than we saw just a couple of weeks ago. In fact, you know, with the exception of rice, you know, natural gas is probably the only commodity that's bucked the downward trend of every financial instrument in the world. And the reason is that surplus is going to go away with cheap oil. And we're going to, you know, expecting a normal winter because no one knows what the winter's going to be coming up as far as weather goes. You know, you're going to have adequate demand for gas. And this winter, what we saw was, you know, prices get down below $2. You're competing with cheap PRB coal. And that's one of the reasons why coal production is low and coal demand is low. And, you know, you'll probably see coal come in and fill the gap that higher gas prices cause. And you know, you'll see probably pretty, you know, constructive prices in 2021, especially in the summer. And, you know, we're not, you know, the expectation isn't a great rally of $4 or $6 or $10 prices like we've seen in the past. What the expectation is more like, you know, a $3.50 market, because you get much higher than that, you're going to start drilling, and you'll start drilling in wells that are right now uneconomic to drill in. And as long as there's some capital out there and profitable, you know, drilling plays, there'll be more production coming online if we get much higher than that in the forward curve. Did I answer all those questions? Did I miss anything?
You did. I think you nailed it. You hit all of them. So thanks for that. Really interesting. We have a bunch of different questions that seem to be centering around what is going to happen to different parts of the renewable side of things. So there's a group of questions that look at, okay, how are we going to manage this intermittency in this grid? It seems like, Joshua, you talked about the duck curve and the effects being a little bit lessened because of how our demand patterns in the residential sector are shifting. There's also a question here about COVID-19 and impact on renewable energy deployment, including the PPA market. And it's directed towards Dr. Colo, to Elsa. And I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on it, but Elsa, if you do have any comments on that, it'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only comment I have on that is probably on the merchant risk rate, and especially when we look at price fluctuations. So, you know, that is a market that has been suffering a bit the last few years. So I think especially because you expect prices to be really volatile over the next kind of at least 6 months, but probably into 18 months, what we're seeing. Again, you're going to see a lot of uncertainty there that's unfolding. And again, it's due to, so that's as far as I can take it. We do have a
That's great.
So,
a follow-on question that first for you, Elsa, and then Joshua, if you have comments on it as well. There's some questions, a lot of questions around stimulus and what the federal government might do in supporting things. And there's a specific question that talks about opportunities for federal and state governments to support, okay, stimulus spending to support the clean energy transition. What would your top 3 be? Places to spend money. And I think of it, you know, I'm looking at the different impacts, and also we've spoken about it, what subsectors, what parts of the supply chain are being most affected, what could that do overall? And so I don't know if you want to list a top 3 or talk about kind of the greatest sensitivities and where you see biggest uncertainties, but love your thoughts on it. Joshua, if you don't mind sharing some thoughts on that next. And Ed, if you want to join in, please feel free to comment on it, or I've got questions for you next after this.
yeah, I mean, I think like if we talk about New York, you have to look at NYSERDA, because NYSERDA is very actively involved in, you know, in helping continuing to stimulate the sector. You know, so I would look to them, especially New York, you know, as we look towards, you know, the recovery of our sector. So that's kind of my number one go-to right now.
Yeah. So my wish list, and I know I have 3. I can't put on the spot. I can't think of the third one right now. I mean, my wish list would be an HVDC super grid across the entire continent that would allow like renewable energy to flow from the middle of the country where it's windy in the Southwest, where it's sunny, or just in the South in general, and allow that to flow and let it hit every single state. Let every single state get a piece of the pie. Let it be a huge blue ribbon project, and like, you know, comparable to the interstate highway system that allowed people, you know, that allowed you to drive across the country in 2 days versus 19 days. Just allow that market to just to open up, and then because we're going to need a lot of jobs. I think it's another 4.4 million more, you know, on the unemployment rolls today. To invest heavily in efficiency programs, because like efficiency programs are very labor intensive, and so we need a lot of people who will be back to work. And so, yeah, those are my 2 main things. I know I'm missing kind of a big one or 2, but those are the if I had a magic wand, that's what I would do.
You know, I'll jump in and tell you, Joshua, you probably get your first wish. And you know, one of the things that's so striking to me is the fact that so many people are talking about before and after satellite photos of pollution. You know, you see them in the paper where it's, you know, Washington, D.C. on February 15th and Washington, D.C. on April 15th. And you see the clear skies and you see the lack of pollution. Everyone's talking about that. It's in the newspapers. The you know, people in politics are talking about it. Just people are talking about it, like, you know, neighbors and emails and things like that. And I think there's going to be a groundswell coming up and saying, hey, one of the data points that we've taken from this virus is, or one of the silver linings we can take from this virus, is the fact that we can have cleaner air. And we should, you know, people are going to want to take steps in that direction, whether that's electric vehicles, whether it's more renewables, maybe it's, you know, that super grid that you talk about that I'd never thought about before. But I think people could demand it. And I think, you know, a lot of people have thought, oh, renewables is crazy Green Deal thing. But I think what this is doing is pouring concrete in those things and kind of providing a here to stay type of mentality to them.
I actually have,
So I'll make a quick comment and then I'll pass it around one more time. Elsa and Josh, we've obviously touched on a good vein, so we'll keep going. One of the questions that I'm looking into and we're researching at the center is saying how much of this is going to be sticky. And I know, Ed, you and I have spoken about this as someone who looks at energy, climate change, and air pollution. It's saying, how far back to polluted air are we going to be willing to go? Now, will 100% of the shutdown stick? No, I can't see that happening. We're going to have some stuff come back. But how much are we going to double down on those initiatives that actually make some of this sticky? I also wonder about how much of our working from home will become the norm. How many companies will say, let's reduce our commercial office space by 50% and keep half our employees at home most of the time, these types of things. It's a really good question. And I think we'll see that as we start to relax and then maybe contract again, depending on what the epidemiologists tell us. And then again, as we go into next year and we start a full recovery, what that looks like. But Elsa, you wanted to comment, and then Joshua?
So what I was going to say actually is that you're already seeing in Europe, cities think about this pollution, issue, right? Because they're like, wow, clean air. So I think Madrid, Milan, they're already looking at urban design, essentially creating more planes, because they're like, we can have our cities have this much reduction in pollution, and how can we do it? And I think this is kind of what you're seeing in some of the European cities that are starting to kind of relax and start to get back to a norm. So I think a city like New York City actually is perfectly positioned, especially because of the decarbonization targets that you have that are a lot more aggressive at the city level than they are at the state level. So it is kind of an opportunity right now to start to think of new ways to meet those targets. In that sense. And then kind of my second point is that, the reason why I mentioned public utilities commissions moving swiftly on decision-making to essentially say that you cannot disconnect customers for non-payment is because we're seeing them make swift decisions, right? And this is the time to actually make more swift decisions that will actually stimulate the economy and our sector for jobs. And they can do that by continuing to, approve dockets that are aggressive on grid modernization, that are aggressive on energy efficiency. So I think this is kind of an opportunity there as well, because commissions are not known for moving fast, but this is a time that they could do it as part of an economic stimulus.
And Joshua,
one more thing. So we have seen something like that. There, we can point to US examples of building out massive infrastructure and it increasing, driving down electricity costs and increasing renewables. You just look at Texas, they built the CREZ lines, then all of a sudden, Texas goes to having, 20% of its energy being met by wind, last year, and that share is growing and solar is about to explode too. So, there's a big, if you build it, they will come, a big field of dreams moment, and it could be realized across the entire US. I'll never stop saying that.
So I will say that this grid expansion infrastructure investment conversation, I may suggest USAE or Dave that we have a conversation about this because we're seeing a bunch of questions. I will pass one along just to get your quick response, Joshua, from Bill Lovelace. Bill, good to see you online. You asked, super grid spanning the US are a good idea, but individual states can block that from happening. Do you see that changing? Do you think that during COVID, we're going to say, you know what, state lines, let's forget about them and build that grid out quick?
Yeah, I know. It's a function of how city evolved versus how the natural gas system evolved. And there is no federal body that kind of oversees these things like there are for pipelines, like FERC. Giving FERC the ability to do that, to site those lines would be helpful, but also doing a better job of making the case or giving every state a piece of the pie, giving them local jobs, giving them local energy, giving them local stuff might be enough to get some of this going. But yes, it is hard to build things in this country as we've seen.
And so I'll pitch the last question to Ed because we're running short on time, only with a minute and a half left. Ed, there's been a bunch of questions about how utilities are responding, how they're managing nuclear power fleets, just the general proactive nature of it. I know I spoke about that in the very beginning, just what we're seeing and the conversations I know were happening well before we were getting stay-at-home orders about how to keep the lights on. But could you just give a couple quick comments about how utilities are keeping the lights on and the importance of it?
So they have process and procedures for almost everything, and they've developed some process and procedures to keep their people safe. There's sequestration procedures, there are social distancing procedures at the plants, there are doing work on, social distancing, even when you're kind of taking nukes down and refueling them. They also have a shelter-in-place comments where you'll put a team together and leave them together sequestered for 14 days in quarantine and kind of put them to work. So there's been a lot of thought put into that. There's been a lot of effort put into it, both in planning phases in the past and planning phases kind of real time right now. I know there was some big issues with hurricanes just a couple of years ago. And one of the big problems that one of the nukes was the people willing to stay at the nukes and keep those things running, but didn't have clean clothes. So, there are washes and dries at the nukes right now. So, there have been actions in place and measures in place long before this to kind of have disaster contingency plans, and that's moving forward.
I appreciate that. Well, with that, I want to thank again each of our panelists, Dr. Joshua Rhodes, Dr. Elsa Colo, and Mr. Ad Fortunato. Thank you for participating and joining us today, giving us your time. And with that, Dave Williams, I will hand it back to y'all.
USAE wishes to thank Dr. Melissa Lott and our distinguished panelists for an outstanding webinar. I know I personally learned a lot. Thank you very, very much. This webinar will be available on USAE's website for future download. If you're not already a member of USAE, we invite you to join. Please visit us at usae.org. Thank you for attending, and I officially close this webinar.